Every time you hear the UFC announces another sold out arena, another record breaking gate, another massive television deal, another $1 billion business move, there's one question that never seems to go away. Where's the money? Because while the UFC has become one of the fastest growing sports organizations in the world, many of the athletes risking everything inside the octagon still say they're underpaid. Recently, longtime UFC veteran Jared Cannonier made headlines when he said elite fighters should be competing under $1 million contracts. Not because they want special treatment, because that's what he believes elite athletes are worth. Now, some fans immediately agreed. Others said, if you don't like the money, don't sign the contract. The UFC has a perspective. The fighters have theirs. And the fans are caught somewhere in the middle. So tonight, we're taking emotion out of it. We're following the money. How much does the UFC actually make? How much do the fighters actually make? And what happens to that money after the fight? Is Jared Cannonier right? Or is the UFC running exactly the business it should? By the end of this episode, you'll understand why fighter pay remains the most controversial topic in mixed martial arts. Let's get it. What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to Knuckle Game Podcast, where we don't chase headlines, we chase understanding. I'm El Benga, and today we're diving into one of the biggest debates in combat sports. Not who has the best jab, not who's next for the title, but something that affects every single fighter who has ever stepped into the octagon. Money. This episode is brought to you by Juggernaut Snacks Knuckle Sandwich, a premium fight-inspired snack built for fans who appreciate bold flavor, championship quality, and a sweet punch in the mouth. Now let's talk business. Here's the biggest mistake people make whenever fight pay comes up. They think this conversation is about greed. It isn't. It's about value. Because Jared Cannonier isn't some rookie looking for attention. He's earned the right to speak. He's fought at heavyweight, light heavyweight, middleweight. He's fought former champions. He's fought title contenders. He's challenged for the gold. He spent nearly a decade proving he belongs amongst the best middleweights on the planet. When someone with that resume says elite fighters should have $1 million contracts, you should at least stop long enough to ask why. Notice what Cannonier didn't say. He didn't say every UFC fighter deserves millions. He didn't say prospects deserve millions. He specifically said elite fighters, the men and women consistently headlining events, the fighters helping build the UFC into the global powerhouse it has become. From this perspective, those athletes aren't simply employees. They're assets. They're helping generate television ratings, selling tickets, driving sponsorships, creating highlight reels, building storylines, keeping fans enormously or emotionally invested. In every other major sport, when the business grows, the biggest stars usually grow with it. Cannonier is asking whether that should happen more consistently inside the UFC. Now, before anyone picks a side, we need to understand how the business actually works. Because once you understand the pay structure, you'll realize this conversation is more complicated than social media makes it seem. Now, here's the biggest myth in mixed martial arts. Most fans think UFC fighters get paid a salary. They don't. Most UFC fighters are independent contractors. No fight, no paycheck. That changes everything. Think about your own job. If you're sick, you probably still have benefits. If your company has a slow month, you're probably still receiving a paycheck. If you take a vacation, your income usually doesn't disappear. Now compare that to a UFC fighter. Imagine spending 10 weeks preparing for a fight, running before sunrise, training twice a day, cutting weight, missing birthdays, skipping family vacations, living with constant physical pain. Then 3 weeks before fight night, you tear your ACL. The fight is gone, the paycheck is gone, but the bills, oh, those are still waiting. That's why many fighters describe their profession differently than fans do. Fans see 15 minutes inside the octagon. Fighters see 3 months of preparation just to earn those 15 minutes. That's an enormous difference. Now let's break down exactly how those 15 minutes are paid, because that's where the numbers begin to tell a fascinating story. Imagine showing up to work knowing half of your pay depends on beating another world-class professional. That's essentially how many UFC contracts work. Most contracts begin with something called show money. That's your guaranteed purse for stepping inside the octagon. Then comes win money. Many contracts double if you win. Simple. Fight, win, double your purse. Lose, go home with half. Then there are performance bonuses. Fight of the night, performance of the night. Historically, $50,000. Sometimes more during special events. Some fighters receive promotional compliance payments. Some receive discretionary bonuses. Champions and major attractions have historically negotiated additional incentives, including pay-per-view points under certain contracts, which is why the numbers fans see online rarely tell the complete story. But here's something the public numbers do tell. The bottom of the UFC pay scale has remained surprisingly low. That's where this debate really begins. Because once you see what many newcomers have historically started with, you might be surprised the conversation isn't even louder. Let's make this personal. Would you accept a job where another trained professional's objective is to knock you unconscious for $12,000? Because for years, many entry-level UFC contracts began around $12,000 to show, and another $12,000 if you won. On paper, $24,000 doesn't sound terrible until you remember that isn't take-home pay. Training camp costs money, coaches cost money, managers, strength and conditioning, nutrition, recovery, gym fees, medical testing, equipment, taxes. Suddenly, that $24,000 starts to shrink. Then imagine losing. You leave with $12,000 before expenses. Now imagine you fight twice in 1 year. Win one, lose one. You've reached the biggest promotion in mixed martial arts, yet you're still wondering how much money is left after everyone else gets paid. That's why fighters become frustrated when fans say $12,000 for 15 minutes isn't bad. because they're not paying for 15 minutes. They're paying for everything required to survive those 15 minutes. And that's a completely different calculation. Now, before you feel sorry for every UFC fighter, let's climb the pay ladder. Because life changes dramatically once a fighter becomes valuable to the business. Here's something that shocks almost every casual MMA fan. Two fighters can compete on the same UFC card. One leaves with $24,000, the other leaves with several million. Same octagon, same referee, same gloves, same organization. Completely different financial worlds. Let's climb the ladder. A newcomer often begins with an entry-level contract. Historically, many have started around $12,000. $12,000 to show, $12,000 to win. Perform well, win consistently, and contracts begin improving. 20 and 20, 30 and 30, 50 and 50. Eventually, established veterans begin earning six figures. Main event fighters earn even more. Champions can receive several hundred thousands guaranteed, along with other negotiated incentives depending on their contract. Then there are the attractions, the stars who move the business, the Conor McGregors, the Ronda Rouseys, the John Joneses. These aren't simply championship fighters, they're brands. People don't just buy events to watch them compete. They buy into the story, the personality, the spectacle, the anticipation. And that's exactly why the UFC has always paid stars differently. Because the UFC doesn't only reward athletic achievement, it rewards commercial value. Now, some fans hear that and become upset. They say ranking should determine everything. Others say business doesn't work that way. If one fighter sells 5 times as many tickets, generates 5 times the attention, produces 5 times the revenue, shouldn't they earn more? That's the fair question. But it leads directly to another one. How much money is actually flowing through the UFC? Because once you understand the size of the business, you'll understand why this debate refuses to disappear. The UFC isn't fighting for survival anymore. It's fighting from a position of incredible financial strength. Think about where this company was 20 years ago. Political opposition, questions about legitimacy, small television deals, limited mainstream attention. Today, global events, international sponsorships, packed arenas, record-breaking gates, massive media rights agreements. The UFC is no longer trying to prove MMA belongs. It already won that fight. And that's exactly why fighters like Jared Cannonier are speaking up now. Because their argument isn't based on where the UFC used to be. It's based on where the UFC is today. When a company grows, employees often expect compensation to grow too. Fighters see billion-dollar headlines. They hear about record revenue. They look at their own contracts. That's where the frustration begins. But here's something important. Revenue isn't profit. People often confuse those two things. A company can generate enormous revenue while still spending enormous amounts of operating capital to run the business. The UFC pays employees, production crews, travel costs, marketing, legal expenses, insurance, venue costs, performance institutes, international offices, broadcast operations, and hundreds of other expenses fans never see. So simply saying the UFC made billions doesn't automatically answer the question, how much should fighters receive? To answer that, we have to compare the UFC to other sports. And that's where the story becomes incredibly interesting. If there is one number sitting at the center of the entire UFC fighter pay debate, it's this: 20%. For years, industry analysts have estimated that UFC fighters' compensation represented roughly 20% of company revenue. Now compare that to other major American sports, the NFL. Players collectively receive roughly half of league revenue. The NBA, also around half. Major League Baseball, again, around half. NHL, close to half. Immediately, fans ask, why aren't UFC fighters receiving something similar? Well, because those leagues have something UFC fighters don't: collective bargaining, players' associations, revenue sharing agreements negotiated over decades. Every NFL player benefits from a union. Every NBA player benefits from collective bargaining. Every UFC fighter negotiates alone. One athlete, one manager, one contract, against one of the most powerful organizations in combat sports. That's an entirely different negotiating environment. From the fighter's perspective, that's exactly the problem. From the UFC's perspective, that's simply the business model. Neither side is lying. They're simply looking at the same business through completely different lenses. And eventually, those disagreements became much bigger than interviews, and they ended up in federal court. Now, this debate didn't stay on podcast. It became one of the biggest legal battles in MMA history. Former MMA fighters filed an antitrust lawsuit claiming the promotion used its market position to suppress fighter compensation. The UFC denied those allegations. The litigation lasted for years. Eventually, the parties agreed to a settlement worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, let's be very clear. A settlement isn't an admission of wrongdoing. Companies settle lawsuits for many reasons. But something important happened. Fighter pay stopped being an internet argument, and it became a legal argument. Economists became involved. Financial experts became involved. Lawyers examined contracts, revenue, business practices, negotiating power. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't, how much do you think fighters deserve? It became, what does the market actually look like? That distinction matters because emotions don't decide lawsuits. Evidence does. The settlement closed one chapter, but it didn't end the conversation. If anything, it made even more fighters comfortable discussing money publicly, which brings us back to Jared Cannonier, because he's far from the only veteran asking questions. So let's do something that's become very unpopular online. Let's look at this from the UFC's perspective. Imagine you're running the biggest MMA promotion in the world. You don't know who the next superstar will be. You sign fighters. Some become champions, many don't. Some lose 3 fights and disappear. Others retire. Some suffer injuries. Some never become marketable. You're investing millions of dollars every year without knowing which athletes will eventually become stars. That's risk. The UFC also built the platform. Without the UFC, many fighters wouldn't enjoy the worldwide recognition they have today. The organization created consistent television production, championship prestige, international expansion, performance institutes, medical standards, global marketing, a recognizable brand. That's value. Dana White has said many times, nobody is forced to sign a UFC contract. If another promotion offers better money, fighters can pursue those opportunities before signing exclusively to the UFC. From the UFC's perspective, the market decides. And honestly, there's truth in that. The UFC deserves enormous credit for transforming mixed martial arts into a mainstream entertainment. But that's only half the story. Because while companies can recover from financial losses, fighters are risking something very different. They're risking their bodies, their health, their future. And that's why many athletes believe the comparison isn't fair. Money isn't the biggest thing fighters lose. Time is. Every training camp steals time. Time with family, time with children, time recovering, time earning money somewhere else. Then there's the physical price: broken hands, damaged knees, separated shoulders, concussion, weight cuts, surgeries, permanent scars. Some injuries heal, others never completely disappear. Brain trauma doesn't always announce itself immediately. Sometimes it arrives years later. That's why many fighters say they're not being paid for 15 minutes inside the octagon. They're being compensated for years of sacrifice leading to those 15 minutes. Imagine spending 20 years becoming one of the best martial artists alive, finally reaching the UFC, fighting 2 or 3 times each year, then retiring before 40 with lifelong injuries, but without lifelong financial security. That's the reality many veterans worry about. Not becoming rich, simply becoming secure. And that's a very different conversation. So, who's right? Is Jared Cannonier right? Is Dana White right? Or are the fans somewhere in the middle? Here's what I believe. The UFC deserves tremendous credit. Without the UFC, mixed martial arts would not exist in its current form. The company took enormous risk, built a global brand, and created opportunities for thousands of athletes. That deserves respect. But past risk shouldn't permanently determine future rewards. The UFC isn't fighting for survival anymore. It's thriving. When a business reaches that level, the people creating the product should grow alongside it. I'm not saying every UFC fighter deserves millions. They don't. Just like every NBA player doesn't earn what LeBron James earns. Superstars deserve superstar money, but entry-level fighters should earn enough to prepare professionally, without wondering whether one loss means financial disaster. Veterans who spent years in the rankings should have contracts reflecting that experience. Champions should receive compensation worthy of carrying an entire division. And elite fighters. The Jared Cannoniers of the world absolutely deserve million-dollar multi-fight contracts. Not because they asked, because they've earned the opportunity. Raise the floor, reward excellence, protect the veterans, continue rewarding stars. Those ideas can exist together. This doesn't have to be fighter versus the UFC, because ultimately, a stronger fighter creates a stronger product, and a stronger product benefits everyone. Now, I want to hear from you. How should UFC fighters be paid? Should newcomers receive higher guaranteed contracts? Should elite contenders automatically receive million-dollar multi-fight deals? Should champions receive a guaranteed percentage of event revenue? Or do you believe the UFC has the right system already? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation isn't ending anytime soon. A huge thanks to you and to our sponsor, Juggernaut Snacks Knuckle Sandwich, the premium fight-inspired snack delivering bold flavor, championship quality, and a sweet punch in the mouth. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, like, share, subscribe, and until next time, keep your hands up, your chin down. I'm Mel Banger, and this is Knuckle Game. Peace.